Hello everyone, welcome and thank you for joining. Today we are celebrating National Careers Week and our guest speaker today will be sharing their thoughts and experiences around relatable role models and unconscious bias. This is an educator session and we hope you're able to relay some of this information back to your students and actually incorporate these findings within the school environment. My name is Neelam Jagate and I'll be hosting the session today. Okie doke. So without further ado, I'll introduce the guest speaker today. So thank you so much to Louisa. Louisa is a head of diversity and inclusion at Chubb Insurance, and you'll be talking to us about relatable role models and unconscious bias and how to tackle unconscious bias as well. So I know you've got a presentation ready. Do you want to tell us a little bit firstly about yourself and your career journey, and then we'll launch that slide deck?
Yeah, absolutely. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Fab, great. So thanks for having me and nice to see some people popping up on the chat here as well. So my name's Louisa. I work for an insurance company called Chubb. I have a background in recruitment, so I spent quite a lot of time working in recruitment and also involved in training managers on how to recruit and sort of focusing on things around unconscious bias and being objective when you come to recruit. And then about 3.5 years ago, I moved into my current role, which is head of diversity and inclusion for Europe, Middle East and Africa. And that role is really about ensuring that we have equity and equal opportunities to people from all different backgrounds to come into insurance, to come into Chubb as our organisation, and also thinking about progression and development opportunities for people as they work through our organisation. So my role is all about designing programs, developing initiatives, and really focusing on creating a level playing field where everybody, regardless of gender, age, ethnicity, disability, family status, socioeconomic status, has an opportunity to not only have a successful career, but also really progress and thrive in our organisation. And the topics today, so relatable role models and unconscious bias, they're both really core to my day job, and they've been core to what I've been doing in the past in recruitment as well. So and also obviously very relatable when it comes to thinking about teaching and influencing students and future talent as well. So before I kick off with the presentation, we'd just really love to kind of understand a bit about the people that we have in the room as well. So I can see Emily, Jane and Lisa. Would be great to know a bit about you in terms of where you're dialing in from, your role and maybe the ages that you work with, just so it can help me with the conversation we have. So either if you want to come off mute or if you just want to type in the chat box and just let me know, whereabouts you're dialing from, your role and maybe some of the age groups that you work with. That would be great to see.
So Louisa, whilst everyone's doing that, can I just ask, how did you make the transition and what actually inspired you to move from recruitment to diversity and inclusion?
Yeah, so it was always an area of interest for me. So as I was working in my recruitment role, and insurance, some of you may or may not know, has traditionally been a very kind of male-dominated industry. Within recruitment, we would see that there's often a circle and an in-group, and a lot of the hiring would be done because people would know each other in the market. And actually, what I started to do was think about, what are the opportunities to bring in people from different backgrounds. Typically, students don't leave school thinking, I really want to work in insurance. It's not seen as one of those industries that's like very sexy or exciting. And so my job, and it was a newly created role, and I basically built the case for the role to say, look, I think we really need to focus on this, and it's a great opportunity for us to think about bringing in diversity of thought and talent and new ideas. But you need somebody to really focus on it full time because it's a very broad role. It's a big job, so it's been great, and I've really enjoyed working in the role. And thank you, Emily and Lisa. So good to know. So you're working with sixth form Emily in Bolton, and Lisa working with 11 to 18 Academy in North Lincolnshire. Thanks for giving us that information. Great. Hi, Jane. Year 8 to 14 across staff. Okay, fantastic. Okay, so typically sort of older years then. So that's good to know. And I can imagine it's not not always the easiest. I did a stint during my university degree. I studied languages, and I did a stint in a school in Milan, teaching secondary school English, and that was very eye-opening experience. So I don't know how teachers do it. You need a lot of patience. So I'm happy to kick into the presentation if that's okay. Yeah.
Brilliant.
Fantastic.
We'll get that launched.
Great. And Emily, Lisa, Jane, if you have any questions at any point, feel free to just come off mute or just type them in the chat box as well. So this is, the idea is to have a free-flowing conversation if we can. But today I just wanted to focus on 3 areas. One is that we're all diverse. So we talk about diversity, but actually, we're all diverse. We all have different backgrounds, different life experiences that contribute to who we are as a person. Hi, Jill. Nice to see you joining. The second is that we all have biases, but we can consciously choose how those biases affect our decisions. And the third is that we're all role models, and we all can be role models. And it's always about thinking how our influence and our sort of shadow impacts others and those around us. So I wanted to start by talking about first impressions, thinking about how long it takes you to make a decision about somebody, whether they're, going to be successful within their career, whether they're somebody that you get on with, whether they're someone that you think, deserves to do well. Researchers have found that we make decisions on people within seconds of just meeting them. And making those judgments based on our initial observations is perfectly natural. Animals, early humans, they relied on these reactions to survive, to avoid being eaten by predators. But what's the impact of that first impression on the decisions you then make and on the person being judged itself? And if we go to the next slide, this is a quote from a book called Blink. And if we just click on the next, it will come up here. So when we make a split-second decision, we're really vulnerable to being guided by our stereotypes and prejudices, even ones we may not necessarily endorse or believe. So Blink was an international bestseller, and it was a book about rapid thinking. And this quote, Malcolm Gladwell wrote this quote, I think it just really makes you think about what are the kinds of things that we might judge people on? What are the kinds of things that you make that really split-second decision on, and how does that have an impact on what happens and, their opportunities and their possibilities going forward? On the next slide, this is an iceberg model. Iceberg's used for quite a lot of things. You may have seen this before, but I think there are certain things, a certain number of elements to a person that are clearly visible. So when you look at me, you can see my skin color, you can see my gender, you can probably guess my age there or thereabouts, but you don't really have an insight into my values or the way I think or my approach to work. And when we consider diversity, they're all the elements that we're referring to. So diversity of thought, diversity of background, diversity of education, and we're all diverse. We all have different life experiences and talents, and these are the things that make us unique. But as humans, we have a tendency to gravitate to those who are like us, who share similar interests, who have a similar background. In sociology, that's called your in-group, so a social group to which a person psychologically identifies as being a member, versus the out-group with which maybe you don't identify as much. And when you make these sort of snap decisions and you mentally put somebody in either your in-group or your out-group, whether that's conscious or unconscious, what you're doing is either greatly increasing or limiting the impact of their voice or their ideas or their way of thinking. And therefore, in an instant, someone who is similar to you can become privileged. But there is hope. And on the next slide, there's another quote here. We're not helpless in the face of our first impressions. They may bubble up from the unconscious, from behind a locked door inside of our brain. But just because something is outside of our awareness, it doesn't mean it's outside of our control. So another quote from Blink. So you can become aware of your biases and these stereotypes that you hold in your brain, and you can consciously decide to challenge them. And that's how we come on to inclusion, which is our next slide. And thinking about creating an inclusive culture. So one where diverse views and ideas are encouraged and heard, and where individuals are valued for their contributions, regardless of race or age or gender, socioeconomic status, if they have a disability or family circumstances. Now, I found a couple of stats on the next slide, and this was, directly related to student successes. And a growing number of studies highlight the long-term impact of teachers' unconscious bias on student outcomes. And as educators, I'm sure you really, you care about your students and you want them to be successful, but accepting the possibility that unconscious bias might be impacting your classroom is quite difficult to imagine. And despite the difficult nature of this possibility, it's really critical to understand the impacts of unconscious bias in schools and work on awareness to help ensure an equal chance of success for all students. And the majority of research has focused on gender and racial bias, and there are a couple of points here. So teacher bias was found to be the primary reason that male students were 19% more likely than their female peers to take advanced maths, for example. Racial bias, so the researchers at Johns Hopkins University compared difference in predicted education outcomes white and black teachers had for their black students, and you can see here, white teachers were 30% less likely to predict their black students would graduate from high school, this is in America, and 40% less likely to predict they would attain a college degree. And then on the next slide is just focusing on that kind of cycle of teacher bias. So when we have lower expectations for a student, our behaviour towards them creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. And that creates a cycle of expectations that can keep some students from reaching or even realising their potential. And these are the 3 steps that the research has shown. So step 1 at the top, at the beginning of the year, if a teacher begins to form opinions about a student based on their grades, their test scores, and what they've learned from previous teachers, that can then become a lens that they see the student through, and that lens impacts the expectation the teacher has for the student's academic achievement, which then impacts the teacher's interactions with the student as well as the learning opportunities given to them. And the student's academic outcomes are then impacted by their learning opportunities and teacher interaction, and that is then passed on to their next teacher, and the cycle sort of starts all over and again. So kind of what we're thinking about here is, how do we break that cycle? What are the practical interventions that you can all take to try and disrupt that cycle? So I've just included 3 practical interventions that you can all take to try and break that. And the first one on the next slide is the implicit association test. And I don't know if any of you, maybe you can just type a yes or no in the chat box. Have you heard of the Harvard's implicit association test, or Project Implicit? You might have heard of it, you might not have heard of it. But what it does is, it really just is a very quick and short test. You can find it online, IAT, or Implicit Association Test. And what it does is, you have kind of a quick fire question, and it will be something like, science, and you're given faces, and you have to work out sort of, what do you typically associate that with? Is it male or female? Or there'll be a test on maybe ethnicity, or there'll be a test on age. And what it does is it sort of digs into your subconscious, and it helps you actually really understand where your biases are, which you may not have been aware of at all. And we all, as I said before, we all have biases. It's all human, it's all natural. But just understanding what they are will then help you create those interventions and recognise when it's happening. So I'd highly recommend, if you have 10 minutes free and you want to give it a go, having a look at this Harvard online test. The second intervention is about you as a role model. So reflect on your influence. Your influence, like your shadow, extends to where you may never be. And research shows that, and what we had in the event information, 92% of those in minority groups feel more included and productive if they come into contact with a role model. Thinking about what positive role models do the students have access to? Are they hearing from people who look like them, who have had successful careers? Are they, do they feel inspired to progress? Do they feel like they have the opportunity to progress? Do they feel like the doors are open for them? And that sort of positive role model spotlighting can really help drive the ambition and drive the opportunities for students, and not just students, for everybody. I know from myself, sort of going to events and hearing from successful women who have had families, who have, maybe come from different backgrounds, and hearing how they've succeeded and the challenges they've faced and how they've overcome them is really, really inspiring. And actually, you come away thinking, I can do that. And it's realistic role models. It's not people who have, come from very privileged backgrounds, and therefore you feel like, okay, they've had a bit of a struggle, but is that relatable? So I think there's 2 points with this one: is relatable role models, but also thinking of yourselves as role models. You are also influencing the students. You're also influencing the way they think, the way they feel, and the decisions they might take. Are you supporting them in their career choices, or are you sort of telling them that it's not going to happen for them? So it's all of that. Sometimes that can have a positive impact. I know one of my friends at school was told that she wouldn't get into a certain university, and then was determined to prove the careers advisors wrong. But I think it's also about using that inspiration, encouragement to really help the students understand that they can achieve, they can be successful in the future, whatever they want to do. And then the final intervention was around thinking about the classroom. So, and this quote here: "The loudest voice in the room seldom belongs to the most intelligent mind." And that's sort of something that we talk about a lot in sort of organisations as well. Is, do you really feel like it's the extrovert that is always always has the best idea? And it's what we try to encourage managers and colleagues to think about is, how do you include the introverts? How do we bring them into the circle? How do we make the environment comfortable so they feel like that they can add their views and they feel valued? Because we know that when people feel valued, they feel that they can succeed. They feel motivated to perform. They feel motivated to to progress, because they feel like their opinions have worth and people want to listen to them. So again, this is part of role modelling. How are you role modelling inclusive behaviours like this, like bringing in introverts to the rest of the class, to the rest of the young adults that you're working with? So those are the 3 thoughts that I wanted to cover: that we're all diverse, we all have biases, but we can consciously choose how these biases affect our decisions, and we can all be role models, and that the role of role models is so critical and so crucial to everyone's success in the future. So that was my brief overview, and happy to open to any questions. If not, yeah.
Thank you so much, Louisa. That was really informative. I'm sure I speak for everyone when I say that was a really, really good learning opportunity. So teachers at home and career leads, if you have any questions, please do bob them in the chat. I'll kick off.
Sure.
So not everyone has role models. And I know you said the 3rd point there is about, understand that you're a role model in your own right as well.
Absolutely.
And very impressionable. So what more could teachers do, particularly for students who they're very aware that they come from maybe a dysfunctional family, or they don't have professional role models in their lives? What more can educators do?
Yeah, I think it's about identifying those role models that people might not necessarily think are role models. Thinking about them from different being a bit creative, thinking outside the box. A role model doesn't have to be somebody who is, at the top of their game in sport or business or, earning the most money. A role model can be somebody that has, it can be a single mum that has, got herself a job and is doing really well. Role models come in all shapes and sizes, and for students as well, I think, it's important to have access to people that look, very different, that they're not always this typical cutout of what people, put on a pedestal and think that's what the role model is, and I'm never going to achieve that. It's about finding relatable people to expose to students. So it could be through, even speaking to them and understanding, like, what are your aspirations? Where do you want to go? What do you think is what do you think is the right career path for you? And then trying to work out, okay, who could we bring in to speak that fits that bill, rather than us projecting what we think success looks like onto the students.
So actually giving them a say, really, in asking
absolutely.
them.
Yeah, because now role models might be influencers, YouTubers. The typical role model is probably changed, and I'm out of touch, but I'm sure people on the call today have understand better than me. But I think, like I say, these role models can come from all different industries, different backgrounds. Just it's about empowering students to realize that they can succeed.
And when you talk about including introvert students and individuals and making them feel more valued, do you have any practical, sort of tangible strategies that teachers can take and embed?
Yeah, and I find there are a couple of things actually I'd recommend. So one is introverts. I'm going to stereotype here, but typically I would say introverts like the opportunity to think about what they're going to say before they say it. So putting them on the spot in the class isn't always the best way to get the most from them. And so what we tend to do within Chubb is, if we have a meeting coming up, and this could be relatable to having a class coming up, making sure that there's an agenda so the students know, the participants know what we're going to cover, what might be some of the questions we're going to ask, what might be the topic that we're going to go through, and even sort of giving them the heads up in advance to say, I'm going to come to you in this classroom and I want to hear about what you have to say because I value your opinion, but giving them that chance to prepare so they feel confident when they come to speak, because speaking in front of the class, I remember it can be a daunting experience, and kids can be quite cruel sometimes about what people say and how they say it. So I think giving them a chance to prepare, giving them the heads up, and just encouraging them as well. If it doesn't work out, they stumble, or if something doesn't work out the first time, just keeping encouraging them and supporting them to speak out and provide their opinions.
I think that's really good advice, especially the whole preparing them, knowing that they may be, they might find it quite, they might be apprehensive about sharing if they're unprepared. Great advice, thank you. So we've got some comments. So Jill says, we use our alumni as role models. That's a really good idea for our students, as they have been in the same position as our students and are often from the similar backgrounds. That's really good. Any other tips, do, put them in the chat. I think that's really really useful. We've got Emily. A lot of our students have their own biases. We try to show them they can do anything they like despite gender or ethnicity. Absolutely. It can be hard to break their own conditioned biases. So that's an interesting one. Biases, it's not just the older adults, it's the young adults who have come into the classrooms with their own biases. I'm a former teacher myself, and that's something that I used to tackle quite a lot in our subjects. So how again, do you have any practical solutions to maybe discussing, raising awareness and educating young people about these biases that we have and hold, and how do we break them?
I think we've come a long way as well. I think over the last few years that, I think people have realised that these stereotypes do exist, that, if you ask a child to draw an astronaut, they'll typically draw a man, or an engineer, they'll draw a man, or something like that. And I've seen some really great adverts recently where it's, they've had people come in to speak to the school, and maybe it's been somebody with a helmet on and they've taken the helmet off and it's been a woman under there as like a firefighter or something like that with younger children. So I think, there's a lot now where we are able to challenge those stereotypes and challenge those beliefs that this is a male profession, this is a female profession, that people who look like me don't get to the top, people who dress like me don't go into this particular job. And I think there's great examples of, of diversity in successful positions. So I would just say, seeking out those, whether it's books, whether it's speakers, whether it's shows, clips, whatever it might be, that show people from the untraditional or unconventional sort of models, then being in those professions and succeeding.
Brilliant. And another question from Jane. I work with mainly students needing additional support in SEND. Managing unrealistic aspirations is tricky. What are your thoughts, please?
Yeah, and I appreciate, obviously, you don't want to set people up for failure either and make them feel like they're not able to succeed in what they want to do. I think it's about helping them manage, sort of creating an action plan that is achievable and is realistic for them. So thinking about, what are your strengths? Even if they need additional support, they still have strengths. They still have areas where they will be better than others. They'll have areas where they'll have expertise or just different ways of thinking, creative ways of thinking. There's actually a really big push in organizations now to hire for neurodiversity. So autism and other kind of learning difficulties. Companies are actively going out to recruit people with sort of different backgrounds in that way. So again, it could just be identifying an organization that has that program and reaching out to them and saying, would someone come and speak to the students? Or profiling some career paths of people. Richard Branson has got dyslexia, and there are a lot of very successful people that needed additional support. So yeah, that's what I would recommend.
I'm actually hoping to work with Jane, if that's the same Jane I spoke to earlier this week. How important is it for maybe autistic learners to learn from autistic role models? Do you think that's a does it really create big impact? Do they always have to have similar backgrounds, or can we match young people with someone without those difficulties? What do you think?
I think a mix is always useful. I think, if you think about mentors or role models, I think it's always good to have a few. I've always tried to seek out a few from a few different backgrounds, because I think if you've got somebody who has had a similar experience to you, then it makes it feel like it's more achievable, more relatable if you can speak to them. But then also, not limiting that to just that one individual or to that one category. I think just having exposure to lots of different people, you get so much more from them. So I wouldn't say, just one role model who has autism, but it could just be a mix of others.
Brilliant. And we're coming towards the end of the session. So can I just leave with this final question? Who was your role model growing up, if you don't mind sharing, and why?
Yeah, I think for me, I had multiple. I think it was, and I think I would take from different profiles and different personalities. So there'd be certain things that I would admire in people. For me, I would always enjoy sort of listening to people present and speak. So, whether it was, radio presenters, news presenters, when we listen to things on TV and just hearing how they presented and spoke, that was always a really motivating for me. And then, family members that with kind of work ethic and sort of had that determination to succeed, that was always a big driver for me. So I wouldn't say I had, one role model. I'd say it was you sort of mesh, because I don't think anybody is perfect. You sort of mesh different characteristics of different people together, and then you find your own individual your own way, and try and find your own way to succeed.
Louisa, thank you very much. And a big thank you to the educators who've joined us, most likely during on their lunch break. So thank you for your time.